I'm excited to be joined by Marc Songini, the author of this wonderful new book called The Lost Fleet. Here we are on Nantucket, and we talked a little bit before we started the cameras about why not Nantucket but New Bedford, and maybe you could explain that, because we think of ourselves here on the island as the whaling capital of the world.
In many ways, Nantucket was the whaling capital. There's nothing, no one can take away from that. But my book is about the decline and fall of whaling. Nantucket is the youth of Yankee whaling, and Nantucket had an incredible 200-year run. Some of the greatest men that have ever been produced by the United States came from Nantucket. The toughest, best mariners, greatest stories, but they were eclipsed by New Bedford due to circumstances far beyond their control, such as the bad harbor and the lack of direct overland links via railroad. And New Bedford, sadly enough, we can look at New Bedford as having been the port that actually had to endure the complete downfall of American whaling. So it's not necessarily something that Nantucket should feel bad about.
We should feel good about it.
That's right. We'll always associate Nantucket with Captain Ahab and Queequeg and all these other wonderful things. But New Bedford had to endure the ugly, slow demise of whaling.
And that is the time that this...
Exactly, exactly.
I had read in an interview that you wanted to write the Gone with the Wind of whaling.
And I did.
Which is really exciting. For me, in looking at it, often I don't think of women involved in the process, and one of the main characters is the wife of your, who goes out on these whaling vessels, which doesn't sound very comfortable. Do you want to go into a little bit about her?
I'd love
because
to.
I think that's
really
interesting.
Thomas Williams was a whaling captain from Connecticut. He sailed out of New Bedford Harbor, and his career started roughly in 1820, and he spent 40 years in the industry. And he wound up, his wife was 31 and pregnant with a third child, and instead of allowing her to remain at home, he brought her on board with him, living in his cabin. And she was pregnant. She was 31. And in fact, in New Bedford Harbor, when she was going over the side, instead of going over the gangway over a plank, they lifted her by block and tackle in a chair. And even she said this is a very novel way of coming aboard.
Right.
And she had there was a little kitten on board, and her husband had given her a geranium, and she knew that this would be a very lonely existence. But she had kept a journal of her voyages that started in 1858 and ended just as the Civil War began in 1861. She said, "I will be lonely but not alone, for I have a kind husband with me." And Thomas was 6 feet tall. Eliza was maybe 5 feet, weighed about 100 pounds. Thomas was a massive man for the time, and it was said that she could fit under Thomas's outstretched arm. And he adored his wife, and she adored him. It was really it was like a teenage romance, and they took it onto the seas to Alaska, to the Sea of Okhotsk, to the South Seas, to Japan, all over the world. And for roughly 20 years, they were a pair cooperating together on this whale ship.
In some really rough situations.
Unbelievably rough.
Yes. I was also reading that because this isn't a novel, it's really a history.
It's a history.
And how did you stumble upon both of them? And how did you, from journals, newspaper articles, tell me about the process of writing something like this as a historical account? Can you talk about
love
the
to.
process?
Love to. I knew I wanted to write about the decline of whaling, as I mentioned. The main event is the 1871 freeze-in, where there were 33 ships, primarily from New Bedford, that were caught in the ice off the coast of Alaska up by Point Belcher. And some 1,200 people, men, women, and children, there were probably perhaps a dozen women and children that were part of that fleet. They had to escape in their whaleboats and sail and paddle some 80 miles down to Icy Cape, where there were 6 ships that were not locked in by the ice and then escape. And I read an account of this, and what amazed me was that nobody died in this, because you're always hearing about some Arctic adventurer or whaler getting killed. And I read this about 7 or 8 years ago, and I was struck by the fact they all survived, and I wanted to write a book about it. And I began to research it, and then I realized something else that was interesting, that the Confederacy had expressly tried to destroy Yankee whaling, in part because of the New Bedford, Nantucket, New London, Edgartown. They were abolitionist, anti-slavery towns, big Republican strongholds, and also because a number of whaling ships had been purchased by the Navy Department, filled with granite, and sailed down to Charleston and sunk in the harbor to block it up. And this exacerbated an already intense hate that didn't need much encouragement. And the Alabama, which was the most famous of all the Confederate raiders, sunk perhaps 12 ships. And then the Shenandoah, which was commissioned almost as the war ended, it sunk some 30 whalers after the war had ended. So I was fascinated by all this. And so I wanted to tie this whole narrative together. And it turned out there had been a family and a captain who had been present at all these events, and not even just at the 1871 disaster, but Thomas Williams had been at the final disaster, 1876, where 12 ships were destroyed and 50 men died, horrible, horrible deaths. And he was at that, and he managed to come through all these things. And as I mentioned before, many of these events were experienced with his family and his wife.
Which seems unusual to me. I mean, so did you use like the ship journals?
There were ship logs, yes.
Ship logs, and did he...
Private papers.
Was he good at keeping records of his experiences, or did...
He was nearly illiterate.
Oh, interesting.
His wife was well educated and very genteel. She kept a log, or a journal in her case, actually. And her voyage with Thomas, which started in 1858 and ended in 1861, she recorded the daily events. She omitted about a month and a half when she gave birth to one of her children, and then she continues it as if she's talking to the person and said, I haven't spoken to you, but we now have a new child on board, and that's why. And
so almost like a confidant.
Yes, it was.
She had a relationship with the writing.
There wasn't another girl, lady on board to her to chat with, so her journal became that for her.
Right.
And at the same time, the first mate of the ship, Samuel Morgan, all of them were from the same little town in Connecticut, Wethersfield. And Morgan was keeping a very masculine journal, log actually, of the ship's adventures. So I would read what Eliza wrote about a given day's events, a death, a disaster, taking a whale, and I would read what Morgan had to say, and I was able to come up with a nice balance and round out the account.
Tell me, Mark, what was the most surprising thing? I mean, it seems to me that, we've studied whaling history, there's Moby Dick, but in this book it seems like you're taking a totally different twist and look at especially the decline of whaling. What surprised you the most? What popped out to you? It's like, wow, I didn't expect to find this.
There was nothing that wasn't surprising.
Okay, the whole thing,
the whole
thing.
And the novel Moby Dick, which I love and hate, which is so great in some areas and so boring in others, it's a fantastic work of art, and in its details, I've been told it's accurate by scholars. But it's done a service and disservice to whaling because it is such a powerful story that people think that is the definitive whaling story. But it's not.
Okay.
And if you step outside that box, you'll see that there were many, many, many stories that were created by whalers that were equally as interesting and equally adventurous, in some cases horrible, in some cases fantastic. People survived. And interestingly enough, one of the things that surprised me was the whaling captains after Melville, the generation after Melville, they didn't care for the book Moby Dick because they didn't think it reflected their profession accurately. Nobody would have wanted to serve under a captain like Ahab.
Okay.
And he probably would have been, there would have been a mutiny or something to that effect at some point, or the mates would have done something. And there were cases of madness in captains and that had to be dealt with, or even in one case a captain was severely depressed, he killed himself. But the captains of New Bedford did not much think that reflected what they did in their day-to-day jobs. So Moby Dick did a service to whaling in that it shows how grand it was and there's lots of detail, but people think that's the last story on it. And I wanted, as I began to study this, to recover and uncover all these other stories, which are equally fantastic.
Right. Well, I am really excited. I haven't had a chance to read it, but I'm really looking forward to it because I love the idea of families in those situations and learning more about it. Marc, thank you so much for spending time with us. And you can get this book, Barnes & Noble, local bookstores.
Sure.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Nice to have you here.